Good afternoon. It's 3:15 on Monday, November 18th, 2019. I'm Kalinda Lee, Vice President for Historical Interpretation and Community Partnerships at the Atlanta History Center, and I'm here with Sue Verhoff, Director of the Atlanta History Center's Oral History Program, conducting an oral history with Jessica McLaughlin Gauthier. Ms. Gauthier has graciously agreed to be interviewed as part of the Atlanta History Center's partnership with the Inman Park Neighborhood Association.
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you were born in New York,
Yes.
but you grew up in Atlanta.
Mhm.
Please tell us a little bit about what brought your family to this area.
Sure. My parents are Southerners. They grew up in northern Florida, and my mother, I guess, went to New York for college, and my father went to New York for work. So after I was born in 1970, they quickly realized it wasn't the best place to raise a child, or it wasn't a place they wanted to raise me. So they did a pretty exhaustive search about small cities around America where they might raise me, and it boiled down to Denver, Colorado, or Atlanta, Georgia. And the reason they chose Atlanta was because, like I said, they were Southerners, and most of their family was in the South still. So I believe we all came down for a couple of trips to Atlanta to look for houses, and they bought the house at 226 Elizabeth Street in Inman Park, and that's where they still live and where I grew up. So, yeah, pretty awesome.
How old were you when your family moved?
So I was born in October 1970, so I was just a little more than 2 years old. We bought the house in January of 1973. So I don't have any memories of being in New York. It's all Atlanta. Yeah.
So having said that, I am wondering, do you feel like a native Atlantan? And if so, what does that mean?
Yeah, great question. You know, I've thought about this a lot because I've lived in places where being native is really important. And I always felt like I wasn't quite a native Atlantan because I wasn't born here. I do feel like a Southerner, but I didn't really feel like a Southerner until I left for college, went to New England. I was raised very aware of the struggles of the South and racism and classism, and I didn't really want to own that history myself. So I went to college in New England feeling very much like I wasn't a Southerner, and realized that I very much was, and very much an Atlantan. You know, really learned to love the history of where I grew up. I haven't lived in Atlanta since I was, I guess, in my mid-20s. So I've been gone for more than 2 decades, and when I come back, it's a place I'm really proud to call home. And I love all of the inner city Atlanta intimacies that I have with other people who grew up here, like going to the Majestic at 2 a.m. after clubbing and, you know, eating pancakes with the surly waitresses. Or I waited tables in Little Five Points at a restaurant when I was in my 20s. And just fun stuff like that, you know, now you go to a lot of the shops and restaurants and you hardly even hear Southern accents, or at least not Atlanta accents. And, yeah, so I feel like it was really special.
I'm intrigued by you speaking about going to New England and realizing that you were a Southerner and embracing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could dig into that a little bit more for us. What specifically do you think characterized being a Southerner for you?
Well, the biggest thing was race diversity. At my college, which I was told was very diverse, it was 2% African American, which I guess for New England was very diverse. for Atlanta, it was very much not diverse. And so it was a little shocking to me, honestly. But it wasn't just that. It was the lack of an understanding of race relations with my classmates. I remember one of our RAs in our dorm was African American, and he was from New Jersey. But some of the white boys in my class referred to him as colored. I thought, wow, that's such an old word. I don't think they meant it derogatorily, but he had to educate them. And I thought, gosh, I thought I was coming to this place of like higher education and people in the know. And what I really realized is that they have their specific knowledge set and I have mine, which is really different. And in my I went to Moreland Elementary School in Little Five Points and walked there, and it was 80% black and 20% white, and it was about 90% lower income. So, that I wouldn't say anybody that I went to college with in New England had that kind of an understanding of both class and race. And that was very Southern, and it was very in-town Atlanta at the time. And then, of course, the food. The food in New England is pretty bland, and I missed, collard greens and black-eyed peas and just all the good Southern soul food I grew up with. The weather. I actually really loved the winter. It was great to be around snow and stuff, but then I'd come back home to Atlanta for the summers and the sweltering heat, and that was kind of funny. I had it reversed. So yeah, all those things. And then I think family ties, we have a very loving family that's kind of spread all over the South, and just the way that we interact with each other and holidays together. And so, yeah, all those things.
Another thing that you said about feeling connected to this place was, you said, I think the way that you put it was that you really love the intimacies that connect you to other people who are from this place. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, both from your childhood and young adulthood.
Okay. Let me think about that. So what's coming up for me is, for whatever reason, I kind of have a wanderlust in my heart, and I've always, come from this really warm and loving, nurturing grounding, and like spread my wings and gone out in the world. And one of the first times I did that was to go to a high school that was not close to Inman Park. I went to North Fulton High School in Buckhead, and that was kind of my first experience of being around kids that went to a different middle school and went to different elementary schools and were in a different part of the city and had different experiences than I had. At the time, Little Five Points was kind of just starting to get hip with skateboard shops and stuff. And so it was like cool. The guys that I went to high school with thought it was cool that I lived in Little Five Points. But it was the guys who were actually in Little Five Points and going to the skate shops and, running around Little Five Points that were kind of my people, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was, high school was really the first time I guess I experienced that, and Little Five Points was definitely like a big part of that. That experience of knowing that I came from this very specific community, and we shared, like when Junkman's daughter was in a different location, it was in a really small little spot at the corner of Euclid and, what is that side street? Anyway, I can't remember. And most of the kids I grew up with went to Grady High School, and there's actually even there's a specific accent that I can almost pick up on that's like very specific to Inman Middle School and Grady High School and kind of this little part of downtown Atlanta from when I was growing up. It's got a little bit of that kind of 80s or 70s skateboard, you know, kind of, and punk was a big thing then, and new age, you know, music, and yeah, I'm kind of not really being able to put my finger on what it is, but it's just so familiar to me, and you know, I can still see people that grew up with me back then, and maybe they weren't even close friends then, but now it's like we have this understanding of where we came from.
That's really nice. So yeah, let's go back kind of in some chunks, if you will, developmentally. So if you could think back about your early childhood, and so maybe like preschool and elementary school period, more or less, tell me what the general kind of feeling culture was like in the neighborhood, whatever you can remember.
Yeah, that's really easy. It was a lot of young families that were really gung-ho about renovating these old homes. That's what my parents were doing. Our house was constantly under renovation. There was a constant flow of carpenters and plumbers and electricians and drywall people, and you know, this hodgepodge of, you know, do-it-yourselfers, and all of our neighbors were doing the same thing. All of my friends in the neighborhood, their parents were all doing the same thing. We were all renovating these homes. And so it was a really big part of growing up there and what we all shared. And then there were all of the neighborhood events, you know, the festival and 4th of July picnics. There was just this incredible sense of helping each other and commiserating about the, you know, burst pipes in the winter, or you know, learning about the newest, best method of hanging drywall over plaster, or whatever it was. You know, it was kind of this common conversation. And it was really rough and tumble, too. I mean, it was definitely, when I was a kid, it was a little bit of a rough neighborhood. There were rough elements. There were, you know, homeless wandering the streets, and there were crimes, and, you know, the kids, we had to be coached about being careful. And again, that kind of fed into this whole idea of looking out for each other. There was an initiative, I'm pretty sure, that was with the Inman Park Neighborhood Association, where we all got whistles one year. There had been some crimes in the neighborhood, and so they handed out these safety whistles. And I actually remember it's a very pivotal childhood memory, where we were given these whistles, and I'm an only child, so I was, you know, often home alone if my parents were running errands or whatever. And I was really, you know, wanting to be responsible with my whistle, but wanted to be vigilant. Like, I really wanted to be a do-gooder, and, you know. So I remember once my dad doing a quick errand. He wasn't gone for long, 10 or 15 minutes, and I was standing by the front door, which our front door is a glass. And I had my whistle at the ready, and I'm looking up and down the street, you know. And one of our neighbors across the street, her dogs got into a fight. And I thought, oh, I should blow my whistle. And I thought, well, no, I shouldn't blow my whistle, because I've been coached that you blow your whistle, you know, certain circumstances, and a dog fight is not when you blow your whistle. So I didn't blow the whistle. And she came out, and she got her dogs, and everything was fine. But when my dad got home, you know, I wanted to be like, you know, I told him that I blew the whistle. And he got really upset, because you don't blow the whistle when dogs are fighting. So I'm getting reprimanded, but my dad is just this sweet, mild-mannered guy, and it was this very, you know, getting reprimanded by him is just the worst thing ever, and didn't happen very often. So then I'm thinking in my head, do I tell him that I didn't blow my whistle, because now I'm lying, and, you know, just this whole thing. So I never did tell him until I was an adult. I just took it. But that's, yeah, the neighborhood was just, it was such a great place to grow up for that, you know, that real closeness. And we just knew everybody. It was really nice.
One of the things that you mentioned in passing as you were describing your young childhood in the neighborhood were events.
Yes.
And so my first question is, were you involved in any formal way ever in any of those events? Did you volunteer or perform or do anything like that?
I did, yeah, for sure. I was in the parade a lot of times. I can't even remember how many times. The first year, I believe, that there was a caterpillar ball. So the butterfly ball was the big formal adult dance party. But they started doing a caterpillar ball for kids. And I was one of the older kids, but I want to say I was still probably only 11 or 12. And my cousin and I dressed up as old people. We had gray wigs, and like I can remember my cousin Anthony wearing a sweater vest, and I had my grandmother's mink shoulder stole. And anyway, we won the costume contest, and as a reward, we got to ride in the parade in the back of someone's convertible, and like wave, and it was really fun. I remember. We had a roller skating club in Inman Park, the girls, and so we roller skated in the parade one year. The first time I can remember my parents, their house being on the house tour, I think was 1978. They could probably verify the date, but so it was my job to kind of be there and be one of the house tour monitors. You would rope off certain rooms and make sure that people weren't coming in and out and of rooms they weren't supposed to. When I was older, I was in my early 20s, I had a booth in the arts festival part of the festival, Arts and Crafts Festival. Actually, I was starting my own business and had a booth that, I did decorative painting in people's homes. And I thought, I'll have a booth in the Inman Park craft fair to kind of advertise my services. And so every year I was very involved. And one of my favorite, I was just remembering this yesterday, one of my favorite things about the festival in the early days was, I want to say it was actually the Sunday night after the festival wrapped. Organizers would all go to, it was the basement of the Methodist Church in Inman Park, and there would be a slideshow. Or maybe it was a week later, but anyway, there'd be a slideshow of the festival, and so it was like this fun recap, and all the neighbors would be there, and we would laugh at funny photos. And as a kid, of course, I was always looking for the photos that I was in, and that was one of my fondest memories of the festival.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause.
Sure.
Sue. We're getting some really good stuff. There's a lot of movement and all.
On camera.
So Jessica, you were talking about all the ways that you were really involved in the life of the community, even as a child.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting. And I wonder if the kind of can-do spirit that you describe in the neighborhood had an impact on that. Do you think that it was really a formative kind of way of looking at things for you?
I think that families that gravitated to Inman Park to raise their children there kind of were all of a similar mind. I feel like, I don't want to say politics exactly, but a philosophy of life that is inclusive, and that includes all generations. Kids were very valued. We were treated like equal members of families and of our community. I never felt talked down to or treated differently by anybody in the neighborhood. It was a very very equal rights on all kind of levels, sort of an upbringing. So yeah, absolutely, the neighborhood had a lot to do with that. Yeah.
So I was having fun listening to you talk about your early childhood. So I want to jump forward a little bit.
Okay.
And learn a little bit more. You began to talk about this, but to learn a little bit more specifically about your high school years and what that felt like in the community where you were growing, right? But also the community was changing and growing.
Yes, yeah, it was. So let's see, after I went to Moreland Elementary School in Little Five Points, and then I would have gone to Bass High School for middle and high school, but it closed. So I went to Inman Middle School in Virginia Highlands. And then I made a conscious effort to not go to Grady High School, where most of my peers went. I went to North Fulton in Buckhead. My parents are educators, and my grandparents were educators, and so I grew up with this notion that, that I wanted to go to college and that higher education was, unparalleled in New England. Like, that's really where I wanted to go. So I kind of had my sights on going to college in New England, and so I chose to go to a public high school that had the best test scores and the best reputation in Atlanta, and that was North Fulton, which is now closed, sadly. But it had a magnet program for international studies. But it was a 45-minute drive from Inman Park. So my parents were very supportive of that decision, but it took a little doing to get me there. So I had a friend in Candler Park who was also going to North Fulton, and next door to her lived a teacher who taught at North Fulton. So my father every morning would drive me to Candler Park to her house, and then the teacher would drive us to school. And then I went to ballet school at the Atlanta School of Ballet in Buckhead, so I would walk to ballet school, and then either my parents or another neighbor would carpool us back down to Inman Park. I both felt very, like kind of an outsider at North Fulton, sort of like, being in a foreign land. It was a little bit of an excitement for me to be around new people, and again, it really took kind of leaving Inman Park and Little Five Points and the whole culture around inner city Atlanta and going to a school in Buckhead to really appreciate those places I had come from. And kind of, it's definitely where I grew up is more artsy and gritty and much more kind of inner city than Buckhead, which was more upper class, even at the public school. Great people, and I made lifelong friendships there. Don't get me wrong, I loved it. I really loved it, but it was definitely different. And the community of Inman Park, it was changing. By that point, a lot of the homes had been renovated, and so when homes would sell, they, people moving in were more moneyed than those of us who had moved in the 70s. And so it started to change a little bit, but it was still, most of what I remembered. I was babysitting at that time, so I got to know some of the younger families with younger kids, but through babysitting. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, let's delve a little bit more deeply then.
Okay.
There are two things that you brought up that I'd like to explore. The first is you talked about deciding to come to or go to school in Buckhead for an academic program, and that you formed friendships there, right? As most high schoolers form friendships around their school community, and you were taking ballet as well. Did a significant part of your social life continue to revolve around Inman Park? And what did that look like, if so?
It didn't really. The friends that I made in high school were more who I hung out with. Until really my senior year. It was my senior year in high school, and I was driving then and had more freedoms, and I kind of started running around more with kids who went to Grady, who I had known from middle school. And yeah, a couple of the girls that I had grown up with. And I'm not really sure why that was. Maybe the luster of the Buckhead friends had worn off a little bit, or the differences that we had were maybe more exposed. In the summers, I remember a lot of my Buckhead friends would do big trips with their families and go to kind of exotic places, or like at Christmas break they'd go skiing. And I had never known anybody who had ever gone skiing at Christmas break before. That wasn't kind of the culture I came from. So it was really more in the summers and breaks and stuff when I'd kind of go back to the friends that I had had before, and absolutely some of them are still friends now. Kind of collected friends, at every stage from every place. Yeah. I think because I'm an only child, I always had, friendships with adults in the neighborhood. I was raised by very adult parents, and always felt, at ease with adults and talking to adults. So that certainly never changed. They were always really supportive and curious about, what my life was like. And I just felt like I was raised by a whole neighborhood, really.
One additional question that's come up for me as you're talking about this experience is this interesting duality in the way that Inman Park at that period of time is described. Some people talk about it as maybe everybody talks about it as a very kind of scrappy place, and affectionately so, but as a kind of scrappy place, and a place that was diverse in its demographics and inclusive in its ideology. Yeah. But there's also a conversation about Inman Park at that era as beginning like a kind of being a place of displacement for some people. And this notion that maybe it wasn't that diverse, that it was adjacent to places that were poorer and blacker and things like that. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering about your perspective on all of that.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the people who are kind of creating the neighborhood again in the 1970s and restoring these old homes, everybody I knew was white, and from a certain class, certainly middle class. And yeah, being adjacent to more diversity is absolutely right. So I went to a school that was incredibly diverse, but in my neighborhood it was really not that diverse. We were all inclusive in our philosophies, and yet the neighborhood was very exclusive, white and middle class. I think that's certainly part of the white guilt that I have carried my whole life. My mother taught at Clark Atlanta University, which is historically black, and I was really aware of my whiteness even then. I mean, it's talked about a lot now, but I was aware of it in the 70s and 80s and growing up, and had a certain level of not knowing how to change it, not knowing how to change things, or other than understanding, what my black friends, their growing up was very different in general. And I think that was a lot of us in Inman Park had those feelings. I would say that was pretty prevalent. Wanting to do better and be better, and not really knowing how, in terms of race and class, really. The reality is those homes, even though they were cheap to buy then, they were very expensive to renovate. And so you really needed a professional income and to be able to hire the carpenters and plumbers and electricians and all of that. So, yeah, I agree with that.
Do you think that desire to, as you put it, do better, by which I think you might mean like in terms of being a person who helps to address inequality, is that what you meant by that?
I think what I meant was that, at least for me, my ideal society is a diversion within a neighborhood. Having black neighbors and white neighbors and Asian neighbors and Hispanic neighbors all in the same place. I don't know if that reality exists anywhere. Although now that I say that, the new Inman Park, with all this new development and all these young people moving in, it's so much more racially diverse than it actually was when I was growing up. Maybe we laid the foundation for that, because it being a really friendly place for development and for people to, from all places to come and live. One interesting thing about my parents' house was that when they bought it, it had been broken down into 7 apartments. It was built as a single-family house in 1908, but broken into 7 apartments. And when they bought it, I think there were 1 or 2 tenants that were still in a couple of the apartments. And so as they slowly started to turn the house back into a single-family house, they kept 2 of the apartments. It's still a triplex. And in there's a small studio apartment on the first floor of their house, what would have been the original parlor, the front parlor of the house. And for years now, they've had kind of a rotation of Muslim women. So there's now been 3 of them in a row. The first one was a white Muslim woman, and then Middle Eastern Muslim woman, and now a black Muslim woman living there. So, it's changing. It's that's actually the actual diversity that I think we wanted is happening. Yeah.
I'm going to come back to that thought. But first, as we're moving through your life, you said that you left Inman Park first to go off to college,
Mm-hmm.
but you talked about being in Atlanta as a young adult.
Mm-hmm.
So you came back after college?
I did, yes, yeah.
So how long were you back?
Let's see. I graduated college in 1992 when I was 21 years old. Moved back into my parents' house, and then into an apartment in Inman Park. And moved around a little bit, but pretty much stayed in Inman Park in apartments. And I lived there until I moved to Colorado in 1997 or 8. So that was the last time I lived full-time in Atlanta. Yeah.
So I want to ask you a little bit about Atlanta and Inman Park specifically calling you back. Because that's a stage in your life, right, where you're making a choice yourself.
Yes.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, financially it made sense to go back home, and I was a performing arts major, so I didn't, just a lot of my classmates from college went off to Boston and New York and Washington, D.C., and, got into the corporate world. When I was in high school, my senior year, I did an internship at the Coca-Cola Foundation at the big headquarters of Coca-Cola on North Avenue downtown, and decided, it was very nice, and the people were very nice, and the work was fine, but I decided right then and there that I was not interested in corporate America. So when I graduated college, I moved back in with my parents, as a financial decision, and knowing that I didn't want to go into corporate America, but really having very little idea what I did want to do. I had a performing arts degree, so I thought maybe I would work in the theater world in Atlanta. This was before there was a movie industry here. I was ahead of my time. So when I got back here, I looked into the Alliance Theater and the Academy Theater. Those were kind of the 2 biggest theaters that had paying jobs. Well, the handful of paying jobs at both of those theaters had been wrapped up for decades, and nobody was letting go. So it became really evident that I was not going to make a living doing theater. So I thought, well, I'd do some community theater, as a volunteer, which I did. And living with my parents got really old really fast, and I just, I realized that freedom came with a job and money. So my first job back here was as a clerk at the in-town hardware store in Virginia Highlands on North Highland Avenue. And I ended up working there on and off for about 4 years. And I kind of loved that because it was the same kind of people I had grown up with, the carpenters and the plumbers and the electricians coming in and day out, and I got to know them, and a lot of them they all worked in all of the in-town neighborhoods. I needed a little bit more money to help pay my rent, so I waited tables it was called the Baker's Cafe. It was a Cajun restaurant in Little Five Points. I worked 2 days a week there. And then I wanted a little bit more money to travel and things like that. So I met a woman who came into the hardware store all the time, and she was a painter. And I had painted so much growing up in a house that's being renovated. I learned how to paint walls and fix drywall and all that kind of stuff. So she hired me as an assistant, and I learned how to paint homes, very well. So much so that I ended up having my own paint company for 10 years. I started it here in Atlanta. And that absolutely came out of, growing up in Inman Park and, again, being around old homes that were being renovated all the time. And that was one of the skills that you needed to have. And my parents, while they had money to hire, skilled labor, they also didn't have that much, as much as we could do ourselves, we would. So I did a lot of painting in their house. So yeah, all of those were choices of my side. I loved Atlanta. I loved being here in my early 20s and going to the Euclid Avenue Yacht Club and getting to know the bartenders and dancing disco at the Point and other places in Little Five Points. That was my stomping grounds, and I just loved it. It was really, really a really fun time. Yeah.
So, in your life as a resident, as an artist, as a neighbor, are there iconic places and people in Inman Park that really come up for you, particularly in your young adulthood?
Yeah, let me think about that for a second. I mean, the iconic place was Little Five Points, and several businesses there that really, I think, made an impact on the neighborhood and on me. There was a Little Five Points pub that I remember as a kid going and having burgers with my parents. There was, when I was older in my 20s, that same location became the Point, which was a kind of a dance club. The Star Bar, which was next door to the Bond Credit Union. And the guys that owned that were plumbers, so I knew them from working at the hardware store. And they had rockabilly bands, so I learned all about rockabilly going to that bar all the time. Actually, the Bond Credit Union was actually ended up being, kind of a central point of both my father's life and mine. I understand that it was kind of created around the community. And because my dad's a property manager, he had a lot of different accounts. And so going to the credit union often was one of his work chores. He taught me to kind of monitor his management business when he would travel. So that period when I was back here in Atlanta in my 20s, I would go to the credit union and deposit his rent checks and, get to know the tellers. And again, that was just this incredible community organization where everybody knew you. It's not like walking into a giant bank branch and maybe one of the tellers. But no, you knew everybody. And I swear half the tellers were his tenants in apartments that he managed. So, just everything felt like home, and comfortable. And I felt like I even still feel walking through Little Five Points like my dad's a minor celebrity, because everybody from their 20s on up to their 50s now has, at one time or another, rented an apartment from my father, because he managed, a lot of apartments that other people owned in and around the neighborhood. what else can I say about that? So yeah, maybe he's the celebrity that I he's the neighborhood celebrity. One of my dear friends, Annika Bender, her father, Don Bender, they actually lived in Candler Park, one neighborhood over, but he was one of the commercial movers and shakers in Little Five Points. He owned the building, I believe, where the pub was, the Little Five Points pub. And then in Inman Park itself, gosh, there are John Sweet, of course, who is our next door neighbor. I babysat his kids and, helped poster the neighborhood when he ran for city council. My mother was always really involved in politics. I remember we had several political parties at our house, fundraisers, I guess they were. When Sidney Marcus ran for the mayor of Atlanta, we had a big garden party for him. I kind of teased my mom that because when I was in my 20s and dating, and she asked me why I never dated doctors or lawyers or professionals, I said, well, first of all, I think they think I'm weird, but I really like a man that works with his hands. I think growing up with all those carpenters and plumbers and electricians at our house, so I married a carpenter. That was my first husband. And yeah, I mean, again, just huge impacts on my life, all of growing up in Inman Park and the way that we lived our lives. Yeah.
Well, this is a great place to pivot.
Okay.
I think. So you started to talk about your parents, and I wondered a little bit about organizations that they were involved in, and particularly organizations that had an impact on you. So, for example, were they involved in the schools or anything like that?
Yeah. I couldn't remember the details of this, so I just asked my mom about it this morning. But there was the schoolhouse on Edgewood Avenue. We called it the Inman Arc because the P from Inman Park had fallen off in some of the buildings, so it's called Inman Arc. And there had been a Montessori school there that I went to, I think, just for a year when I was 3. So when we first moved from New York. And then the Montessori school decided it was going to close. And so my parents kind of scrambled together with a few other parents whose kids were there, saying, we needed a place for our kids to be during the summer. And so just for that summer, they did a very affordable preschool for, I don't know, 10 or 15 kids. It was very small. And charged just enough to keep on one of the teachers to kind of, watch all the kids. Because there was a playground in the front yard, and this school, I don't know if it was originally built to be a schoolhouse, I'm not sure. And then later they helped, kind of as the next school year started, they helped make sure that school kept going. It was a preschool, I think, through kindergarten. So they were active in that. My mother was the first female president of the Inman Park Neighborhood Association, and I was very proud of that. Campaigned heartily for her. That would have probably been in the late 1970s. I don't know how long those terms were. It probably was just a year. And then my father was head of the beautification committee, is what they called it, the Inman Park Beautification Committee, for years. And they planted a lot of trees in Inman Park and took care of some of the public parks, the gardens, and did some of the plantings in the gardens. What other organizations were they part of? Well, my mother was, at some point, she was on the board of directors for Planned Parenthood. So when I was in high school and did my requisite, volunteer work to graduate, I did it at Planned Parenthood in downtown Atlanta. That was fantastic. And again, like I said, my mom was always really politically, she was a political science professor, so she was very politically active all the time. So I always knew what was going on in local politics. She never ran for office, but Mayor Bill Campbell and his wife Sharon lived in Inman Park, and I babysat for their son. That's kind of an aside, but sort of an interesting history piece. What other organizations did my parents? You know, I feel like the Inman Park Neighborhood Association was just always a big part of our lives. You know, just whether they were on committees or not, they were always very involved. And the neighborhood people knew that they could count on them to be involved. They're very, civic-minded people. Yeah.
So speaking of civic engagement, as we've been talking to people from Inman Park, sometimes people talk about organizations, and a lot of times people talk about activism, whether within organizations or not.
Yeah.
And so they talk about things like the downzoning efforts and the road fight.
Yes.
And the trolley barn restoration.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to know if you have any recollections of your parents' engagement or even your own in any of those things.
Yes, I'm so glad you reminded me, because I have a great story about the road fight. The road fight was a big deal in our family, and we were all very much engaged in it. You know, picketing and parades with signs and placards, and I don't remember how long it went on. It felt like a big chunk of my childhood, you know. You know how time is when you're younger. It seems like, you know, it's a lot longer than when you get older. So there was, it was in the winter. I want to guess it was in February, and I was in high school. I was probably a freshman in high school. So as I told you, I went to high school in Buckhead, so getting home in the afternoons was quite a trek. So I usually didn't get home till 4:30 or 5 or even 5:30. And I remember walking home from the Inman Park MARTA station, and I had forgotten my house key. It was very unusual that my father wasn't home, but usually if he wasn't home, he was running a quick errand. He worked as a school teacher, so he was usually home, you know, by 3:30, 4 in the afternoon. So I didn't have my key, and he wasn't home, so I sat on the front porch, and I had, you know, in my coat and hat and gloves and, you know, my school bag, and just waiting, you know, when can I get in and get a snack? And I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. He's not showing up, and it was unusual, and I was getting colder and colder and colder. And, you know, it didn't occur to me to go to a neighbor's house or anything. I'm sure I could have, but I was kind of shy, and so my thought was, how do I get warmer? And I was walking around the house and knocking on all the doors, and nobody was home. It was really weird. It was starting to get dark. So there was a table on our front porch that for whatever reason had a big heavy quilt draped over it. So I crawled under the table and thought, oh, I'll just wait for my parents to come home. Because, of course, no cell phones, you know, that, right? So waiting. Finally, someone comes walking up the front stairs, and I peek my head out from under the quilt, and it's a neighbor from across the street, and he said, Jessica, there you are. Your parents have been calling and calling and calling the house phone, and they're so worried. You know, what are you doing on the front porch? I said, I locked myself out. I don't have a key. And he said, well, your father's in jail. You better come with me. And I was like, what? You know, what happened? So it turned out that there was a demonstration in a park in, I think it was one of the little parks on Ponce de Leon, but it had to do with the road. And he just got a wild hair and climbed a tree that they were about to cut down, and said, "You're not cutting this tree," you know. And you know, he's got some funny stories about being in the tree and, you know, how they were talking to him and all that stuff. But anyway, they hauled him off to jail, and so of course my mother had to go and bail him out, and John Sweet also went to bail him out because John was an attorney and our neighbor, and he might have been there also. So yeah, that's how I got locked out when my dad was climbing a tree to save it. Oh, that's what it was. They arrested him for breaking branches in a tree that was public property, in a tree that they were trying to cut down. Hilarious, right? Yeah. Yeah. So yes, the road fight was really, really big in our family. John Sweet later got my dad's arrest records and blew them up and made them into a piece of art for me. That we still have, of course, yes.
I love that. I love that. It's like a big old extended family.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the road fight was a big issue
Mm-hmm.
facing the community. I'm going to turn forward a little bit and ask you what you think are the biggest issues facing the community now.
Mm. Well, I just yesterday visited with a neighbor friend, Andy Rhodes, who I met when I was in my 20s, and he has lived in a couple different houses in the neighborhood, and it's traffic. Traffic is really, the population of the neighborhood with all of the new development, it's more than doubled. It's probably tripled or even quadrupled. So that's a big issue. My parents really don't talk about issues. They're both very positive minded, and they both know that life changes and the world changes, and it's better to embrace those changes than to complain about problems. So there may be more problems that I'm not aware of. I know at one point infrastructure of sewer systems and water was kind of an issue, but I think that's really citywide. Lake Avenue used to flood terribly in heavy rains. It may still. That's right at the base of our block. It's actually, the neighborhood I think is safer, street crimes, than when I was a kid. Another story you might be interested in, it's from my childhood, if I may digress a little bit, just about the seedy side. So the house next door to us also had an apartment in it, and there was an older white man who was living there. He was a drunk, and his adult son and a friend of his son's came to live with him for a while. And I was probably 10 or 11 and heard a gunshot. And I was watching the Dukes of Hazzard and thought, well, they're in a car chase right now. There's no gunshot. So I went running to the front door again, which is a glass front door, and looked out, and I happened to see the father, holding his stomach, running down the block, and the son's friend threw something into the bushes, which we later was probably the gun, and jump in his car and drive away. Several neighbors called the police, and the police came. Well, I was the only witness, so the police interviewed me, and it was really an interesting experience to have when you're that young. The father ended up, going down to there was the Austin Avenue Buffet, which was a bar that was down on Lake Avenue, and he stumbled into the bar, and someone got him an ambulance, and he didn't die. He was okay, and he didn't even press charges apparently. But that's how. It was seedy. It was definitely, when people say, like, it really was. And now, now there are so many bars and restaurants around my parents' block, but it feels safe, and I think the occurrence of crime is a lot less because there are people around all the time. When I'm home visiting, I stay in my old bedroom, which is on the street side of the house, and I was definitely kept up Friday night by people walking by, to and from the bars, and those little scooters that are around the neighborhood. I understand that's a problem. But I kind of like a lively. If I tried to live in that bedroom full time, it'd probably be more of an issue, the street noise and stuff. But it's kind of exciting for me to come back to the city and experience those changes. Yeah, and I know they enjoy walking to the market and being able to walk to restaurants and right in their neighborhood. That it never was that way. So that's it's kind of like the city came to them.
So you already started to answer this question, but just to say a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
how would you characterize Inman Park to someone new to Atlanta? If I was a newcomer and I was looking for a place to settle,
Mm-hmm.
would you recommend Inman Park? And if so, how would you describe it?
Boy, let me think about that. I think in terms. I work as a realtor, so I think in terms of real estate and about the homes and the actual physical presence of the neighborhood. So I would describe it as it's an elegant turn of the last century neighborhood with these beautiful old Victorian homes that were renovated in the 70s and 80s, and probably renovated again in the 2000s, most of the homes. It's very expensive. But I think it's definitely a place for someone who appreciates art and crafts, architecture, and enjoys being, in a vibrant. It's very vibrant. It's very, very lively, and it's still very involved. I understand that neighbors, still. The festival still happens and other things, other events. But it's also now got this huge youth population, 20s and 30-somethings, and lots of apartments and condos. And yeah, I guess vibrant is really the word I would use. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you have a favorite Inman Park memory that you haven't shared yet?
I can remember the July 4th picnics used to be in Poplar Circle, and that's the park at the corner of Waverly Way and Euclid Avenues. And one of my best friends lived right across the street from the park. And all of my friends growing up, there was a core group of 3 or 4 of us. We were all girls, all in the same class. There were a couple of them had older brothers, but it was, this core group of girls. And we were all tomboys, roller skated, and we all got, get so excited about the July 4th picnic because all the neighbors would be out, and there'd be Kentucky Fried Chicken in buckets and popsicles. And I remember one year running around, and we thought it would be hilarious to drop ice down the backs of the adults. And again, nobody got pissed off. Everybody was really had fun with it. And that, when I think back about, there's so many individual memories. I couldn't possibly pull them all up, but that image of just being a kid and, sweaty in July in Georgia, and, eating fried chicken and playing with ice, and, just all generations just kind of gathered together to enjoy each other's company. That's what we were there for. It was nothing fancy. It was just potluck food and blankets on the grass, and just really, genuine people living together in community. Yeah.
Is there anything that you feel is important to share as part of this interview that I have not asked you?
Let me think about that for a minute. I think that there are times and places that sort of define an era. And I love that Inman Park was chosen for this project because I think it defined an era for me, certainly. But the way that people came from lots of different places into Inman Park in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, recognizing the beauty of the neighborhood and the homes in the neighborhood, and recognizing that it was a place that really needed to be restored. And then, the community that kind of grew out of that desire to keep the art and the culture of the neighborhood alive, of the homes. It really is, the homes are the foundation of it all. It's something that's hard to replicate. As an adult, as I've moved throughout the world, I've tried to recreate it because it was so magical. Just that balance of community and love and support and art and hard work and civic mindedness, all of that. It's been really hard to recreate. I've lived in Denver and I live in Hawaii now, and I've come the closest to recreating it in Hilo, Hawaii, which is a really small town, just 50,000 is our city, and I live in an old house that I'm renovating, and all my neighbors are renovating their houses, and we're all do-it-yourselfers, and yeah, I just think Inman Park really, it was just magical for me, definitely. That's what how I want to end it.
Thank you for
You're
being
welcome.
so gracious and eloquent and generous with your time.
Thank you. It was great. I'm really honored.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.